The World Government Summit wraps up in Dubai. What were the key issues addressed at the event? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Thousands of world leaders, including presidents, prime ministers, heads of international organizations, experts, and 8 Nobel laureates were in attendance at the summit. This year's theme, Shaping Future Governments, resonated with the organization's goal of leading international cooperation while finding innovative solutions for today's most pressing challenges. CGTN's Jim Stenman has this report from Dubai.
It's been a busy few days here at the World Government Summit, now in its 11th year, as this gathering of some 4,000 delegates, thought leaders, and policymakers prepares to wrap up, having touched on matters such as economic growth, artificial intelligence, and future government, as well as food security. As ever, climate was at the forefront of discussions, with the managing director of the IMF praising the UAE's hosting of COP28 late last year, which ended with an agreement that signaled the end of the fossil fuel era and also laid the groundwork for deep emission cuts. Meanwhile, COP28 President Dr. Sultan Al Jaber also celebrated what the climate accord achieved on his watch, which certainly raised the bar on global cooperation in the energy transition. Appearing remotely, the creator of ChatGPT, Sam Altman, talked about unlocking the power of AI, calling on youth to embrace the limitless potential of the technology, but also warned that the future is still unknown. Altman made headlines late last year when he was ousted and then rehired as CEO of OpenAI, the Silicon Valley company behind ChatGPT. And in a rather surprising move, American journalist Tucker Carlson joined the summit to reflect on his highly unusual interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin, while the event also offered this year's Best Minister Award for Transformative Leadership to Qatar's Minister of Health. During the World Government Summit, the UAE also launched a $200 million fund to finance the development of technology and finance research in developing nations. The country, which has emerged as a leading hub for the Global South, has previously funded economic and social development projects in Africa and Asia through various development agencies and aid organizations. Jim Stenman, CGTN, Dubai.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Saurabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Rabat, we're joined by Ottaviano Canuto. He is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and former vice president of the World Bank. Also in the U.S., Andy Mock is a senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And from Dubai, we're joined by Jeffrey Schlegelmilch. He is the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Climate School. Welcome to all of you. Jeff, let me start with you. Welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. You are in Dubai. You did, in fact, address that summit. The theme of the summit this year was Shaping Future Governments. What can you tell us about that theme and what the summit is trying to achieve, the kind of awareness that it's trying to bring to us as we look at the future?
Absolutely, yes. And the summit had a wide range of issues, as you heard in the prior report, ranging from AI to food security. The panel that I was directly a part of had to do with global health and how we look at 21st century urban landscapes and the role of health and healthcare, how we can integrate technology into that. And being a disaster professional myself, of course, looking at what are some of the trade-offs, what are some of the ways that technology can really help, achieve these promises of resilience that we hope to have in an era of increasing disasters, while at the same time also avoiding some of the pitfalls or some of the vulnerabilities that can also be exacerbated if we rely too much on technology and then suddenly it fails us in the event of a major disaster.
Right, and Jeff, I'm guessing that many of the issues that were on the table at this summit are also integrated. I mean, as you say, you focused on health, but you'd also be looking at the impact that climate change is having on health, as well as the impact AI would be having on how we deal with health in the future.
Absolutely, and so climate change is a backdrop of really sort of setting the ecosystem of our ecosystem that we're dealing with that is leading to increased hazards, which of course have enormous health impacts, and AI also being a new tool that has its perils, but also can help unlock just in its pure computing power and the ability to draw insights and draw connections to really help serve as a solution if it's properly wielded. And I think that's in the spirit of what all of the discussions were in the summit, is first to deep dive into some of these specific subject areas, but then zoom out and see what are the connection points, what are the synergies, how do these come together towards achieving these broader goals of better societies for the future generations.
Saurabh Gupta, I mean, looking at global governance and the debate that's going on about global governance, we see all of this happening against the background of two major conflicts that are taking place right now in Ukraine and in Gaza. We also see tensions rising between the rich developed world, the Western countries, as they sometimes called, and then the other countries of the global south or the developing world. Now, the goal of this conference is to kind of bridge that gap, provide a platform for international cooperation. How big a challenge is that? Because we're not seeing much of that, are we?
Oh, it is a tremendous challenge, and it'll remain a tremendous challenge for a long time. And that's why these summits are useful, because they bring us together to understand where our commonalities lie and where the common challenges lie, and challenges that crosses borders, and which necessarily requires all the major players to be pulling in the same direction. The U.S. and China are two major players in the system, of course, from a defense, from an economic standpoint, but also from a technology standpoint. And while the U.S. and China have understood the common challenges that they face and are working together on issues like climate change, on issues like public health, in the area of technology, the two countries understand the ramifications of the immense developments in the technology sphere, but are decoupling, frankly, be it AI, be it quantum, be it chips. The two countries are moving in different directions on frontier. I don't think the Chinese want it to be that way, but the US is at the higher end of the technology ladder in all these these areas, and sees a Chinese threat. And frankly, if the two major players are not able to cooperate and have dense science and technology exchanges with each other, which could be at the basis of many of the solutions to these problems, and global governance provides a framework to tackle and cope with these problems, these will just remain challenges. And so while the summit is an important one and brings important parties together, at the end of the day, global governance, I don't think the challenges are not going to be resolved anytime soon.
Ottaviano Canuto, the chairman of the summit, Mohammed Abdullah Al-Jagawi, who is also the United Arab Emirates Minister of Cabinet Affairs, this is what he told delegates. Let's listen.
$17 trillion were not invested in building, education, or health, but in wars, destruction, and sabotage. These wars are a direct result of hateful thinking and negative emotion towards each other, fueled by media chaos, and fear from the future and pessimism, whereas approximately 6% of this number could cover the cost of the most important challenges that humanity is facing in 1 year.
So, Ottaviano, the minister's making a key point there, isn't he? I mean, the world spends a huge sum of money on death and destruction, and a fraction of that, if that at all, on things like education and healthcare. What are your thoughts on that? How do we change that?
The chairman is completely all right in what he says. Fact of the matter is that those resources might be alternatively used to lift the education and health of the poor part of the planet, and unfortunately, there is a high likelihood that these things will get worse because we are in the middle of an arms race, and that's overall countries ramping up the expenditure on military equipment and on military expenses, and that will mean exactly a fiscal deterioration in some countries, and the difficulty to find resources to be used in alternative things like education and health care of the poorest. It's a pity, but it's a fact.
Andy Mock, the International Monetary Fund as well as the World Bank have expressed concerns that the Israeli-Hamas conflict in Gaza right now will impact global financial security. The IMF predicts that global GDP will grow by something like 3.1%. That's a modest increase over the previous year, and that there should be an easing of inflation this year. But how do you think that conflict in the longer term could affect financial security?
Well, Anand, I think this is a concern for governments and investors all around the world. The hope is that if there is a ceasefire, if things do not get worse, then any economic and financial collateral damage can be minimized. But I think the danger here is that if there is an escalation, or that this conflict is not addressed or managed in a reasonable way, that it is exactly right, that it could have long-term, very destructive ramifications. Obviously, that part of the world, the Middle East, is growing in importance financially. It long has been very important for strategic reasons because of energy. So certainly, I think it represents an important risk facing the world going forward.
And Andy, on the question of global governance, and this is more of a political question, but can the system, or is the system working right now when we see that in many instances international law is not respected?
That's a great question too, Anand. So I think the first thing is we have to recognize that governance, when it comes to nation states, is very difficult. And it's difficult in ways that warfare is difficult. In that, first of all, crucial decisions have to be made under conditions of extreme information, limited information. The second is that the role of chance is very important. So bad things can happen, good things can also happen. And then finally, it can be difficult to do even seemingly simple things. So when we look at this, this reminds me of Clausewitz's On War, where he describes this as the fog of war, chance, and friction. And how do you address this? It can only be addressed through leadership, or what he calls, quote unquote, genius. The innate ability of leaders to choose the right action, to maintain poise, remain courageous under very, very trying circumstances. So I think this is the world that we are in when it comes to governance. And then the choice of leaders and who gets to lead, I think, is very, very important, and something that we see in certain countries where there is stable, consistent leadership. The results follow from that. Others where we see changes that result in policy changes, vacillation, that this can lead to similarly negative effects.
Jeff, getting back to some of the public health challenges that the world faces right now, many of the leaders of the World Health Organization were at the summit. In fact, the Director General had this stark warning. He said, "History teaches us that the next pandemic is a matter of when, not if." He went on to say that as things stand, the world remains unprepared for the next disease X and the next pandemic. Question is the world listening? How grave a threat do we face?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. I will say that it was very top of the dialogue, and certainly the ones that I was a part of and on the periphery of at the summit. And it's something that's taken very seriously. I think on the technological side, there was a lot of promise. There's a lot of talk of, use of AI, use of what we've learned in terms of vaccine production, personal protective equipment, telehealth, things like this are all sort of things that we now have recent history lessons learned to better the response. But then, of course, there are a lot of things that just haven't gone well, and a lot of movement that we're seeing in the U.S. and elsewhere to sort of do sort of the after-action reporting and kind of move forward in terms of better understanding what worked and what didn't work. What I will say is one of the key factors in how the pandemic has played out and how future pandemics will play out is on the political side and is in the leadership that governments either provide or don't provide. And I can't say that there's anything truly definitive that came out of the summit, but it is encouraging to see that it's being talked about, and it's being talked about openly. It's being recognized that this is one of those what we call wicked problems in disaster management that we need to continue to pay attention to and to continue to work towards, because of course he's absolutely right, the Director General of WHO. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and that timeline gets shorter and shorter the more we're traveling and the more we're seeing a lot of these global interactions that have the potential to spread diseases.
There was one development, Jeff, and that is the WHO announced that an international agreement on pandemic preparedness and response will be ready in May of this year, that is. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, and this sort of comes on the heels as well, too, of some things like the international health regulations and ways of sort of setting a consensus among different nations across the world in terms of how we engage as an international community. And I think that we heard from various ministers of health as well as those involved with this, really sort of trying to reassure people that, one, this is substantive and it's designed to represent a consensus. It is not, and they made this very clear, it is not designed to take away a nation's authority or its autonomy or its sovereignty, but instead to come up with a consensus on how we all agree on how, and mutually sharing information and mutually working towards better pandemic preparedness, that we can do a better job in future pandemics and really work together with this as a foundation of that. So I'm cautiously optimistic, and certainly there were a lot of champions there and people very close to it that really wanted to make it very clear that this is intended to be a consensus document, not a top-down ruling on what you should and shouldn't do.
Right. Saurabh Gupta, Arab News reported that governments are facing three major issues right now. This is in the context of this World Government Summit. And those three major issues are climate change, the growth of the digital economy due to the increasing use of AI, and a new Cold War. What are your thoughts on those three concerns?
Oh, yeah, I think they're absolutely correct on those concerns. Some of these are manageable. Some of them are not that easily manageable. The Cold War that is coming and which is already underway, there are limits. I mean, we are gamed into structural dynamics and sides are moving forward in that respect. The hope is that the major powers, the US and China, can understand the systemic consequences and look at it from not just their own vested interests or national point of view, but from a broader systemic perspective and how to maintain a general consensus amongst themselves on the fundamental and most important issues so that this Cold War doesn't distract from those other larger challenges. But in terms of the challenges like on climate change, I mean, yes, there has been significant progress, including technological progress. But it's also, I mean, it is a matter of resourcing our countries to be able to manage these challenges. I think one of the problems, and we've seen that coming out of the pandemic, is we have these supply chain snafus. Then we had because of that, suddenly there were. We had the interest rates go up. We had interest rates go up. The cascading effect of those interest rates have on many countries is that they've not been able to manage and cope with their debt and their interest payments. At this point of time, we are also asking them to do anti-poverty measures, climate change measures, and that's obviously creating a lot of problems. And so I think the point out here is that countries can find commonality, at least in terms of resourcing these challenges, to try to make it as inclusive as possible in coping with these challenges so that some countries are not benefiting from this process, but that all countries are taking their equal share of the burden. And again, this comes down to global governance. Think in this year itself, or last year, the US said, let's have an equi-proportional increase in terms of our quotas at the IMF, at the multilateral development banks, because the US wants to maintain its veto-proof power in places like the IMF. But the day for that should have changed because, I mean, China is hugely underrepresented. Global South is underrepresented within these frameworks. Until it is not found or seen to be fair that the burden is being equally shared among countries, it's not going to be that easy to tackle these challenges. So it's a complex state of affairs, but we'll have to persist and work through the challenges and going forward, frankly.
Ottaviano, AI was a key topic at this summit. I mean, it's a huge debate. It's a debate that gets more intense every day as that technology develops. Let's listen to Jensen Huang. He is from the chip company NVIDIA. This is what he had to say.
Own your own national intelligence. You cannot allow that to be done by other people. And that is a real realization. Now that we've democratized the computation of AI, the infrastructure of AI, the rest of it is really up to you to take initiative, activate your industry, build the infrastructure as fast as you can so that the researchers, the companies, your governments can take advantage of this infrastructure to go and create your own AI.
So, Ottaviano, there we have Jensen Huang, who's one of the leaders in the development of AI technology from the company NVIDIA, talking about owning your own national intelligence, talking about the technology that's out there. And, of course, we are getting into the intelligence age right now. What are the risks inherent in that? And how do governments respond?
Right. And as any technological revolution, such as the one taking place with AI, we will face both opportunities and challenges, and the answers to which are not that simple. Take, for instance, what you said about the owning a country's own AI. The problem is that the large language models have different performance across language, okay? And so the non-English speaking countries may not fully benefit from AI advancements. There are some, for instance, some recent research showing that despite the multilingual capabilities, advances in the medical field supported by large language models might not be equally distributed across language. And that's just one challenge. Second, much has been said about the potential job displacement in the private sector, and it's true, combined with increase in productivity for whoever stays in a job. The IMF has recently presented the results of our research in that regard, and the same thing will happen in the civil service, for instance. There will be some susceptibility to disruption in jobs that involve clerical and compliance tasks. Disruptions in revenue mobilization. A new generation of tax reforms will become inevitable as the AI technologies disrupt the traditional employment models, and that's something that will be dealt with. Issues regarding the state legitimacy, and at the same time, the possibility, that's more positive, of new democratic arrangements. More innovative participatory processes may be adopted, may be facilitated by the technology. So you have two blades in the scissor, and with a potential of disruption, while at the same time a potential to bring in increase in productivity. If I may just remark one thing. Yeah. On this set of a challenge inevitably faced by mankind that will require all of them concerted solutions, multilateral solutions, rather than individual or groups. I know we have a combination of shocks, a possibility of a new pandemic, the climate change manifestations, the wars, and this almost biblical combination of a plague, climate change, droughts, and plus war is already quite clear. We have at this moment 4 choke points accounting for more than half of the global trade. If we include the Panama Canal and the effects of the climate change through El Nino, if one takes, of course, what's happening at Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz and so on, this affects more than half of the global trade. So we gotta have concerted global solutions. Otherwise, the problems will multiply themselves.
Andy Mok, in many respects, China has taken the lead in the development of this technology, this new AI technology. But at the same time, China has also expressed its concerns on how this technology is used. I mean, we saw that at the APEC summit last November, when there was agreement after that summit between President Xi and President Biden on the military applications of AI. So where do you see it going as far as China is concerned in the years ahead?
Well, this is a very complex but also very important question, Anand. To start with, I think China's position is that there should be equal access to the key technologies that make artificial intelligence possible. So Jensen Huang talked about countries developing their own AI infrastructure. So on the one hand, I think this is a very sensible thing to say, and it of course makes sense that he is the CEO of a company that sells the hardware for this. But at the same time, the U.S. is looking to restrict the flow of technology to countries that it has disagreements with. So I think this is a very important problem that needs to be addressed. Then we have to look at what do we actually do with this. And I think of this new generation of artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, like electricity. So, of course, every country wants its own electric grid to decide how it wants to use this new power. But this is inherently a political problem in that certain countries will use them better and will gain power relative to other countries. This also can be disruptive domestically as well. So I think this is a political question that needs to be managed very well. I think China brings some important strengths here. One of the big concerns that people like Sam Altman have about the advent of AGI, or artificial general intelligence, is that the power and the gains will accrue to a handful of companies or a very narrow set of actors. Whereas we see in China that the state, the government, has the ability to balance competing interests, and at least in a structural way, and certainly, the government's aim is also to ensure that advances from technology benefit as many parts of society as possible. So I think this is very important. And the final point I want to make is that the way China is approaching this is also very holistic and systematic. It's not only from a hardware or software perspective, but also from a theoretical perspective as well, in thinking about what does it mean to where data is so important that some call it the new oil. So one policy response China has taken is to say that data must be considered a factor of production, like land, labor, capital, and technology. And I think this will have important theoretical implications that will lead to policy implications that will lead to things that we see in our everyday lives.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.